What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for Supergirl Season 4, Episode 13, titled What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way, which is actually a title of a Superman comic book, as well as a movie, or not the title, but that comic book inspired a movie. There's a movie called Superman versus the Elite that was based off that comic. It's not one of the better DC animated movies, but it's also not bad either. It obviously stars Superman fighting the Elite, who, the leader of the Elite, is Manchester Black, just like in this episode. The season has been building up to Manchester Black along with Menagerie as well. Now this episode also introduced the Hat, and they even brought one of those invisible aliens, and I actually did like those invisible aliens. So this brings together some of the better villains on the show. Like the invisible aliens were pretty good CGI villains, while Manchester Black was one of the better actual villains on this show ever. Menagerie wasn't great, but I actually did really like the Hat in this episode, so the villains definitely were pretty great in this episode, and just off the bat, that makes it a lot better than most episodes of the show. But this episode began with Nia training to become Dreamer in the Fortress of Solitude, which is always nice. It's always pretty cool to see the Fortress of Solitude on the show, especially when Superman shows up along with it, which he didn't in this episode. But still, most of the training wasn't really Nia actually training. It was learning about her powers as well as the descendant she has in the future, which is Noor Nal, the Dream Girl from the comics, and a lot of that was talks with Brainy, and the whole storyline had this thing where Brainy and Calyx were kind of rivals, and I did like that. It was kind of funny, and there was also this one moment where Brainy actually mentioned Karate Kid, Val Armour. He only said Val, and said that Val taught him a move, obviously referring to Val Armour, the Karate Kid, so that's another character mentioned that is a member of the Legion of Superheroes, so that is pretty cool. But this whole storyline, definitely not the best part of the episode, but I don't think it was bad either. There were some interesting moments, like the moments I mentioned, and although they didn't really convey this before this episode, it turns out Nia has a lot more powers than we thought. I thought that Nia can just dream something, and then that actually happens in real life, which I guess does have some use in the field, but also at the same time, I don't like that costume, the costume as well, but the powers. I really don't like how those powers would act in a fight scene, but these new powers that Nia all of a sudden has, which she can astral project, and she can turn the Dreamer energy into actual energy blast, which they never even mentioned at all before, and I don't think Dream Girl can do that in the comics either. So I mean, it does make a lot more sense, and to go out to the field as a superhero. At the same time, it would have been nice for them to actually explain the fact that she can do that before this episode, where it came out of absolutely nowhere. But I do think this is a little bit better than just being able to dream a little bit into the future. But anyway, obviously the main storyline in this episode is the Superfriends, as Supergirl calls them, which they've never been called that before. I don't think. It was just the Supergirl and Barry, or Kara and Barry, they called each other Superfriends. But apparently this team is actually called the Superfriends now, which I don't mind. I think that's a pretty good name for them. It's not like they can call a version of the Justice League the Super Friends. That I would not like. So this being called the Super Friends, I do think it makes a lot of sense. But it's the Super Friends versus the Elite. The Elite consists of Manchester Black, the Hat, Menagerie, as well as the invisible alien that I can't remember the name of, versus the Super Friends with the Supergirl, Martian Manhunter, who never really turns into Martian Manhunter, as well as Brainiac 5 and Dreamer. So I do think this episode had a lot more going for it than any episode of the show before. Like I said earlier, this episode had some pretty great villains, with Manchester Black, who is one of the best villains on this show. In this season, we saw his character development, which isn't incredible, but it also is far better than most villains on the show, and he's not even the main villain of the season at this point, and I'm pretty sure he was supposed to be in the season, but they changed it a little bit. But he's not even the main villain. He does have some pretty good character development becoming this villain. Now in the comics, he does have this psychic powers that I kind of wish he had on the show, just because on the show he's kind of a rivals with the Martian Manhunter, and that would make a lot more sense. But other than that, I do think the Elite are pretty great villains, and I honestly wish they were the actual villains of the season. At this point, we don't really know who is it Lex Luthor? Is it Agent Liberty? Is it Manchester Black and the Elite? We don't know at this point, but I kind of wish it was Manchester Black. I think he could have been a good villain, or a good main villain of the season. As we see in this episode, he was a pretty great, if not like a little bit underused, because he was defeated again in this episode, right after being defeated last time, villain for this show. But the storyline in this episode was Manchester Black putting together the Elite and killing all the people who are against aliens, because Manchester Black, although not an alien, was engaged to an alien that was killed by Agent Liberty or was killed by one of the Children of Liberty. I'm not 100% sure, I don't really remember, but that was his origin story, which led to this episode, which it wasn't like the most complex storyline. It was basically just a basic cartoon supervillain versus superhero team, and I kind of like that. I mean, this show doesn't really do complex very well, and although that does mean that doesn't really make it a great show, just because, or it's not even a good show, just because all it can really do are these pretty simple superhero versus super villain team storylines. And I honestly think if they just stick to that, then they can be a pretty decent show. Like, they're trying too hard, and they're really going to a place where they can't really handle it, which is they're trying to be a little bit more complex than they can handle in this season, especially with all the politics and all the alien stuff going on. I do think that they just would do better with just superhero versus supervillain, which is not what I want out of a normal superhero show, but this is not a normal superhero show just because it doesn't seem like the writers on the show really are good or like decent writers at all, so just make it a little bit more simple. And this episode did kind of do that a little bit with the Elite, who are definitely not exactly the worst in their views. Like, they're the exact opposite as Agent Liberty, and they have the right to be that, but also they take it to another level, and just because of that, they're bad guys. And obviously this episode portrays them as fully 100% bad guys, while the Super Friends are fully 100% good guys. And I do think the show does that a lot better. It felt more right for the show to just do plain good versus plain evil, even though the Elite aren't exactly 100% evil, just like the Children of Liberty, but still the episode portrays them as such, and it kind of works. It kind of works for the most part for this show, making this episode, just because of that whole thing, a lot better than really any other episode in this season. But after that whole Super Friends versus the Elite fight scene, and after they were all defeated, there was Supergirl went up to destroy this satellite, which this satellite was targeting any alien spaceship that entered the planet's orbit. Supergirl destroyed it, kind of making the president her enemy a little bit. I do think this whole scene, I think it looked really good. I think it was probably the best action the show has had, if not ever, in a very long time, where Supergirl, in her new costume from earlier in the season, which is so much better than her regular costume, she flies up into space to stop that satellite from blowing up the White House, and then there's Manchester Black, who follows her using the Legion ring, which I do think was a pretty awesome scene, where he's flying, but also shooting with his guns at Supergirl, which obviously wouldn't really do anything, but I do think this whole scene looked really good. The action was not bad, and then Martian Manhunter, in his human form, which I hate that so much, came in and stopped Manchester Black, while Supergirl went up to divert the satellite and let it hit the water, which there was no way she knew that would happen unless she used her supervision, which they didn't really show that, but that's definitely possible that she did. And I also do kind of think that this whole scene does look pretty great, like something the show doesn't really do very often, have a good looking scene. I think this scene was something like that. It was basically all CGI, and somehow they pulled it off. I do think this was easily the best part of the episode. Now, the Supergirl destroying the satellite, I don't know if we were supposed to root for that, just because I don't think they conveyed the fact that the satellite would be bad well enough, because the way it's described is going to protect the Earth from all the alien invasions, which there have been a couple in this show already, so I don't see it as a bad thing. I don't think they conveyed that part of it well, but I do think the scene is an amazing scene just by how it looks compared to the rest of the show. There are some other storylines to talk about, like with Lena and Haley and Alex, as well as with James. I'm not going to go over those just because it didn't really have anything at all. Definitely not the highlight of the episode, and probably the least interesting part of the episode as well, so I'm not going to really go into depth on those. The one I am is the one with Ben Lockwood. He's now out of prison, and he's going to meet with the president, and in the end of the storyline, which is definitely not the most interesting part of the episode, and definitely not the most memorable, but it has some interesting moments. Like, in the end, he is hired to work for the White House. I don't really know where they're going with this, and he's the director of Alien Affairs. We're going to see where they're going with this. I honestly have no idea at this point, but there was a cool moment at the end where he killed that guy who was screaming at him and saying that he should take over as Agent Liberty. It was a cool moment. Again, I don't really know what they're doing with Agent Liberty at this point, but this storyline definitely was not bad either. But in conclusion, somehow Supergirl Season 4 actually came out with a pretty good episode with episode 13. This episode was not bad. It had a pretty good storyline with the villains of the week, I guess you want to call them, although they're not really villains of the week. And there were some great moments in this episode as well. Easily the best episode of the season so far, which, again, not saying much considering this episode is not exactly an incredible episode, but for this season, for the show in general, it is definitely one of the better. So I will give this episode an 8.7 out of 10, which doesn't sound high, but it is by far the highest score in this season so far. But let me know your thoughts on this episode in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.